Welkom terug. Ons bespreek vanaand die aanvullende begroting en gesels nou met Vere Shaba, meganiese ingenieur, entrepreneur en die stigter van Green Design Africa, en Dr. Albertus Marais, advokaat, geoktrooieerde rekenmeester en die stigter van AJM Tax, oor die impak op entrepreneurs en ondernemings. Welcome to WINSLYN, guys. Vere, I'm going to start off with you. The President announced 276 planned infrastructure projects. Now, you operate within this industry. What's the feasibility of these projects?
Hi, Divan. Nice to be here. In terms of the feasibility of the projects, I think that the thing about infrastructure projects is that they're very long term. So obviously, during the pandemic, hospitals came up in months. And that was quite quick, but the majority of the time, infrastructure projects take some time. So the feasibility of it, I do think it will happen. I know, for instance, with my company, Green Design, we're currently actually going to be starting on site next week on a public sector project. So I do know that obviously the tendering process takes time, and then the infrastructure time, that also takes a bit of time. But I do think that they're feasible. He did say that a commitment was made from different parties. And I also know that a lot of bailout funds were issued by the IMF to governments across the world. So I think now it's not so much whether or not they'll happen. I think it's just making sure that they happen in a streamlined way that tries to avoid things like tenderpreneurs.
So let's say these projects happen. We know that small and medium enterprises, that's where the real jobs are actually created. What's the likelihood of these smaller contractors actually working on these projects?
I think unless government is intentional about ensuring that SMEs are part of the project, sometimes the smaller people don't get into the projects. Because ultimately, if you look at Africa, 90% of the businesses in Africa are actually SMEs. So I would say that government would just have to be very intentional about the procurement system to ensure that the guys at the bottom actually benefit from the infrastructure projects that have come out.
Albertus, obviously we want these projects to get off the ground, but government has to find the money to fund these. Where is the funds actually going to come from?
Yeah, so Divan, the government has committed 100 billion rand to be spent towards these projects for the next 10 years. Now, whilst the president made the announcement of these committed funds that have been received towards these projects, the very next day in the supplementary budget speech, we had very little, if any, detail on where the funds will come from. Look, ultimately, government is going to borrow from the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and it will be necessary for government to enter into public-private partnerships, ultimately, for private sector to provide the bulk of funding. And government needs to come up with a way in which to incentivize those investments.
Albertus, the minister also mentioned in his speech that he's going to find 40 billion rands worth of tax over the next 4 years. Did he give any indication of where this tax is coming from? And if he didn't give any indication, where do you think it's going to come from?
Yeah, sure. So he didn't give any indication. Look, Devon, it's interesting. 40 billion rand, considering a budget of 1.8 trillion rand, is not a big amount. So it's not a massive amount of money. So what it tells me, if we're going to increase taxes with 40 billion rand over 4 years, that's increases of less than 1% annually. So what that tells me is government has come to the realization, and I think quite correctly so, is that the South African public is overtaxed. If it is going to balance the books, it needs no longer, and it no longer pays to look to the income side of the budget. In fact, it's probably a fruitless exercise. What it needs to do is get its spending priorities right, and to look at the allocation. That being said, the 40 billion will come from somewhere. It will come from budget creep. In other words, that the tax brackets at which relief really is provided for to marginal income taxpayers will not be adjusted. And secondly, government has introduced in the budget speech earlier this year reforms relating to the deductibility of interest, the carrying forward of assessed losses for companies, which they want to limit, and lastly, to scrap some incentives which they think are no longer productive and which encourage economic growth.
Absolutely. Vere, you're operating in an industry that's really battled after 2010. It's a tough trading environment. Give us some idea and some advice for other entrepreneurs out there of how you actually got it right to keep your business afloat, especially during the last 3 months.
Yeah, I think the construction sector has been in a recession for 5 consecutive quarters. And obviously now with the COVID pandemic, that only went to exacerbate it even more. Around us, I mean, I've seen companies that have gone under. We've seen the large construction companies that really needed the projects to end on time and on budget. They have had to go through business rescue. And so I think what's been interesting is that it's the small to medium enterprises that have been able to survive the recession. And that's mostly because the overheads are so low. Absolutely. So how I've been able to do it is that our overheads are quite low compared to how much we're spending. And I think it's easier for us also because we're a lot more agile. So a lot of the larger companies, the larger projects were put on hold. But for us, for instance, during the lockdown, we were actually still working on design projects and still meeting as a team because also we weren't paying staff in terms of like my staff is not as much as a larger company.
Absolutely.
So I would just say that how I was able to do it with my business in engineering was just to really keep our costs as low as possible and to continue to work on reserves because that's the biggest thing is to constantly save as much as you can for times like these.
Absolutely. Vere en Albertus, thank you so much. Is daar enigstens waarde in ons finansiële markte? Ons neem 'n kort breek en gesels daarna met gereelde gaste op WINSLYN, Chantal Marx en Louis van Rensburg oor beleggings en aandele. Bly ingeskakel.